Hi, Nicholas. How are you doing today?
G'day, Peyton. I'm very well. I have my cup of green tea in hand.
Oh, good, good, good. So you sent me a list of terms recently that you felt that you described as being thermonuclear. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about the background behind that, and also we can maybe talk about some of these terms that you highlighted in the document.
Sure. So I had that document's been sitting as a possible, I've got many of these, a possible draft to work on for a blog post or an essay. And it had come to my attention, it swam into my consciousness that there's an explosion of new terms which usually have some kind of ideological component. There's certainly terms of engagement, to use a military term. They're terms from our language, terms that are being made up in our language, which reflect the changes in politics, the changes in sensibility, the increasing polarisation of our ideological landscape. And now, so I don't sound too abstract, one of those terms is gaslighting. Now, those terms, I love some of them. I hate some. I love gaslighting, for instance. I hate some of them, like microaggressions, for instance. But that doesn't matter so much as what they portend. And it seems to me, and this, I mentioned this to you, I sent this to you, which is really nothing more than some notes and some terms. After we were I sent you a long email exchange between me and a couple of friends, and I said to you, here's an example of people who are actually trying to have a good conversation, and they all think they're pretty, they're kind of intellectually with it, and we were sort of speaking past each other. And I don't say that with any rancor, because I know how hard it is how hard it is to get on someone's wavelength, and I think we've already talked about that once before when I have quoted the philosopher R.G. Collingwood and his engagement with the Albert Memorial, which he thought was absolutely hideous, until every day he got more and more angry as he walked past it in Kensington Gardens, and then eventually started saying to himself, well, perhaps I'm asking the wrong question. Perhaps I'm just saying this is hideous, and I'm not trying to say to myself what was the architect trying to achieve when he built that thing. You never get an answer to that question you never get any, you never find out what happened then, what he ended up saying, but it's his way of explaining a turn in his thinking. So I was reflecting on the fact that knowledge is the knowledge that we exchange with each other, which is encoded into words, is the tip of a very much larger iceberg of tacit knowledge and so on. And then I sent, and it was the prompt to send you these terms, because what these terms do is they announce our culture's preparedness to wade into the unconscious, to do political battle with people, not on the basis of what they've said, but on the basis of what they might have intended, or possibly not even that, because it's also acknowledged that they might not have intended offence or oppression or rudeness, but that they were. Now, I'm not here to tell you that there's anything unreasonable about that. In many ways, that is a demonstration of the sophistication and the power of these terms. The problem is that this is a democracy and anyone can use them. And to take the term gaslighting, which I think is a marvellous term, and for anyone who doesn't know, kind of, I expect almost everyone, the few people who might listen to this recording, they'll know that it sort of means trying to get someone to think that they're crazy and that you're actually, and in so doing, you're defining reality. And it comes from the 1942 or thereabouts Hitchcock movie called Gaslight, in which that's the plot, and Ingrid Bergman is kept captive by someone who convinces her, is trying to convince her that she's going mad. He's a baddie.
Yeah.
And the point about gaslighting is that it's there's a lot of gaslighting that goes on in the world. And you could say, repackaging a bunch of analysis from people like Karl Marx and Adam Smith, that the ruling class, the ruling ideology, is a process for gaslighting the oppressed and making them think that it's all their fault, and so on and so forth. So far, so good. The problem is that by the time we get to, let's say, late adolescence, maybe it happens earlier than this, we've already had some arguments with our parents in which we think they're going crazy and they think we're going crazy. And so that's bilateral gaslighting, if you like. And so these terms are, because these terms are so, they're sort of quite brilliant often, and they're very powerful, and we put them in the hands of people, and they're tremendously strong weapons. And so that essentially gives people the weapons to massively escalate any argument into a meta argument about what's wrong with the other person, and it's a bit of a disaster. So that's the cultural moment that we're in. The audacity of a culture to say we can all lurk around in this subconscious world. We can have public debates on television where people are awarded for saying things in the glibbest and shortest and dumbest, downest possible way, while dealing with issues of immense subtlety and immense sensitivity. Good luck with that one.
Well, I think this is a really interesting way of putting it because, just to name some of the other terms on this list, we have gaslighting, microaggression, triggered, safe space, cultural appropriation, misogynist, dog whistling, virtue signaling, and of course, woke. These terms it's almost like a kind of, a lexicon, a vocabulary list of really contemporary terms being thrown around in politics, but the way you describe them as being part of an attempt to, I think you said, wade into the subconscious and to almost to turn something into a meta argument, or maybe in other terms to draw attention to like a rhetorical strategy that's being used on a person, but one that's not potentially not a particularly, let's say, fair rhetorical strategy. But it's different than, just saying an ad hominem argument, right? Where if you say to somebody, well, traditionally, if you attack someone saying that they're a misogynist when you're having a discussion with them, that could be just treated as an ad hominem attack, right? It's an insult.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you make a distinction between that idea of an ad hominem attack and what these terms represent. Would you say? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know whether I haven't. I wrote most of those things a while ago, and you might have read it this morning. It's not terribly long, but I don't know whether I said that or not. But it's a very interesting point, and I think you can. These terms are all designed to dip into ad hominem, the ad hominem territory, but in order to strengthen an argument. So they do blur that line between the ad hominem and whatever that you will probably know the Latin for ad, whatever the ad subjectum, what we're not playing the man or the person, but actually going with the arguments.
Yeah.
And that's right. These are, if you like, opening up the fourth wall. They're sort of transgressive and they're postmodern in that sense, not in the disparaging sense of that it's sometimes used to mean that there is no reality, but they're postmodern in the sense that they're hyper aware that that the reality between two people in a discussion is a mutually constructed reality, and they're militant. they're trying to take charge. They're trying to say, I'm being gaslit. You're doing the gaslighting. So yeah, they're this. Yeah, so they operate in this. They operate in this world where they operate in a world which is normally an unacknowledged world, but they don't acknowledge themselves. They present themselves as objective ideas, but they're not, or they certainly cannot. They're certainly capable of being used in ways that are very, very far from objective.
Yeah.
Whatever the hell that means. Whatever the hell the word objective means in that context.
But I think in a way, it comes back to this term gaslighting, because I love how you put it in. I'm looking at the document now. That's why I'm a little bit able to talk about, the traditional definition of gaslighting is to try to make someone believe they're crazy so that you can manipulate them or use them, right? But the way you also say it is that it is it claims that the other person is occupying a different reality to the speaker, and that it's the speaker who represents the actual reality, right?
That's right. That's exactly
that's a really interesting way of putting it, because then it becomes the question of I think you can think of a movie like Inception, where they keep going into the lower and lower levels of the subconscious, and which person is representing the actual reality, and can you gaslight someone who's gaslighting you? I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Well, my claim is that that bilateral gaslighting is the most common form, and it is in fact a rite of passage. It is you can hardly claim to be an adult if you haven't had that experience. You can hardly claim to be an adolescent if you haven't had that experience. And maybe little pre-adolescents start having that experience when they had fights with friends or parents, and in some ways, we've had quite a few discussions about. I think in our very first discussion, I talked about my technique that I try to, one of the things that sets off little bells for me that I might be able to learn something really valuable is when I get surprised by something. Now, if I'm too heavy on the gaslighting terminology and all these other things, I'm going to defend and let's say this person has said something that I think is an affront. I think it's implicitly elitist in some way. It's implicitly complacent, or any number of things. Then I can quickly say, let's go through these lists. Well, I could say there's some of what their presumption towards me is a microaggression. We'll leave triggered and safe space alone for the moment. Virtue signaling, but we can also talk about gaslighting. These are all terms that one can use from a defensive posture, and one is in an offensive position. One is defending oneself and saying that the other person is at fault. And so the problem is that as good as these terms are, as important as they sometimes are, because you need to stand up for yourself and you need to recognize deliberate gaslighting when you see it, or even non-deliberate gaslighting. But you must try, I argue I must try, not to let that cover up your opportunities to learn from someone, including people who you don't agree with and you don't even like. And our culture's not very strong on those latter things right now.
Yeah, it's interesting too. These terms, they put as far as rhetorical strategy, they put the speaker in a victim role. would you say?
Yes. Oh, absolutely they do. Absolutely they do. And then, and this connects up with stuff like, there's now huge amounts of mandatory training. In Australia, we've got, parliamentarians are now required, all their staff have mandatory training. And of course, the abuses famously continue, but everyone gets their mandatory training. So who the hell's gaslighting whom, you know? So venturing into this territory with a bureaucratic or regulatory mindset is an absolute minefield, and it's not really terribly promising. I'm not in by the, I was going to say I'm not claiming I know what to do here. I do know that plenty of people who I respect just have their, just are driven up the wall with this sort of training. As consultants come in and get you all to imagine being a white person or a black person, or get you all to, say what's in your innermost thoughts, and it's just an absolute train wreck of a situation. And they'll say how we all have to trust each other and all that stuff, and of course you can't. And then on Monday morning, you get to work and everyone's heard what you've said. It's a sort of a fantasy world. It's a nice idea to say we should build trust. I think that's right, but saying we should do it is a very different thing to knowing that you have or not.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in the sense that I don't know. I mean, what is the source of trust? In a way, it's not necessarily fully knowing the other person and their well, of course, knowledge about a person is important, but it's also about knowing that they have some, skin in the game or some shared interests.
Oh, or just that they have some integrity that you're happy to trust. They don't have to have skin in the game, except their skin of their own reputation, their own sense of themselves. But yeah, so you can't just sort of say, right now we're all going to trust each other. That's an abuse. That's a piece of gaslighting, quite frankly, as far as I'm concerned. See how easy it is to throw these terms around. The other thing I was intrigued by one of your reactions to this, because you're working in an organisation, is the way in which these terms can't really be used in management. And I think that's pretty interesting. But then again, you see, what I thought about was that the term I've got underneath gaslighting is it's converse, because this is a thing which is constant, that there are also what I call the new pieties, where they're constantly used in management. And these are things like value statements and things which I think largely mean nothing, but which are constantly said by management, and something in this is starting to happen in the United States, but it's been going. It may have started in New Zealand. I'm not sure, but this is acknowledging Indigenous dispossession at the beginning of every meeting, and so this in Australia, people start meetings, and often if there's numerous speakers, and particularly if they're from the government, or particularly organisations that regard themselves as very morally worthy, each of these people before their speech says, "I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, their elders past, present and emerging." And these forms slowly change over time. Don't do anything, you just acknowledge it. Now, I mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Almost everybody who's this is so well accepted in Australia that people on the right, other than the stronger right-wingers, but they do it too. And I don't know, I dislike it because it's a piety, it's a form. I can see the arguments for it, but anyway, it makes a nice shadow where you kind of very generous in this tacit world, but it doesn't amount to anything. It never flows into anything. It was a nice. I'll see if I can get it. There's a blogger called Freddie DeBoer who I just mucked up. I just hit the wrong button. Who wrote about this quite recently. I'll just see if I can find it. See you, Matty. Yes, this is it. I think this is it. 21st century racial politics always takes place in the shadow of our inability to do anything about our racial problems. He's an American. We're forever creating weird rituals to centre and honour and elevate black people in lieu of feeding poor black children or freeing black prisoners. The deal we've made essentially is to say, sorry about all the oppression, black people, can't do anything about it, but tell you what, white liberals will be very weird around you for the rest of your lives out of a very sincere desire not to offend or oppress you. We can't do anything about black poverty or violence against black people, but we'll act like racial injustice like double plus bad in polite society. Also, Wells Fargo will send out a very respectful Kwanzaa, you can correct me on the pronunciation, Kwanzaa email every, what's that?
Kwanzaa.
Kwanzaa email every holiday season. So that's nice. I think that's quite marvellous. And that's, that's probing in a comic and very acid way the boundaries between the tacit and the acknowledged and what the hell it is and action, or what the hell it is you're going to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is interesting, this process of creating rituals in a way to try to deal with realities we can't change. I mean, it gets to a kind of religious thinking, I suppose, in some sense. A kind of wishful thinking too, in a way. And that sort of does have a connection to some of the stuff I've read, that you've been working on in terms of the gap between the realities of politics and what politics sets out to do.
Exactly. And a particular thing that I'm trying to think about, I can't say I've made a lot of progress, but in fact, the conversation that I mentioned at the outset of this conversation was a conversation in which I quoted James Burnham, who we've also spoken about. And this is Burnham talking about Machiavelli and Machiavellians, that is his term for a bunch of Italian political theorists, drawing attention to the distinction between wishes and reality, which is, so I'm sort of I haven't talked about this enough and thought about it enough to put it very clearly, but obviously politics is about the ought. Obviously politics is even for conservatives, has to be about what the world ought to be. That's what it's that kind of discourse. So it's not about a distinction between idealism and realism or stuff like that. I don't think that's what it is. It is whether you build your ideas about what you ought to bring about, how they are anchored to your own conception of reality and your own conception of what is possible and what is worth building on and what is a foundation of sand that can't be built on. And I think, and I don't agree with James Burnham's or many of the Machiavellians went off and became fascists. I don't admire that. Burnham didn't, but Burnham was quite a strongly right-wing guy. He was also a cold warrior, which might have been a good thing. But what I want to say is that for the left, this question cannot be what the left have done is the left doesn't want to know about that. The left wants to live in its desires, in its wishes. And you have to unpack those wishes and say, which wishes do we think we can build towards in a secure way. By that I don't mean that you're always going to win. I just mean that you have the feeling that you're building on something solid rather than something that is going to turn to nothing or turn into tyranny or whatever. And the left doesn't want to know about that stuff. It's not, and so there's this huge confusion, I think. And now I'm sort of getting further than I've fully thought through how to say this, so I might have to revise it at some stage. But I think there's this huge confusion between how radical your diagnosis of what the problems are and how radical your proposals are to do something about it. Because I can be as radical as I like. I can say we should have a revolution. We won't have a revolution. So now I also think if we had a revolution, that would probably be a bad thing, not a good thing. But I can pass myself off as anywhere on the spectrum of radicalism by just saying, let's have a revolution, by amping up my wishes. And amping up your wishes isn't going to help anyone. There you are. That's a reasonable statement of what I think.
Well, I think that distinction is really important. And, I think an example of this is pretty simple in American life. If people see you reading a book by, Karl Marx, they think that you're some kind of socialist. But if you read Marx, you can certainly see that there's some valid criticisms of capitalism that are being made.
Yeah.
And so you can read that and appreciate the critique. But at the same time,
James Burnham was a Marxist to start off with, and he never really stopped being a Marxist because he believed, like Joseph Schumpeter, another very conservative guy. James Schumpeter published a book called Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy. The first half of it on capitalism is a Marxist analysis of capitalism. It's a Marxist book. He just says, I'm a right-wing Marxist. I'm going with this idea that, and his basic idea in capitalism, socialism, democracy is not that he's okay with class struggle, but he doesn't think class struggle is the absolute beginning and end of history. But what he thinks is that Marx is dead right when he says that every regime devours its children or devours its parents, actually, because it builds on a social foundation that has been built by the previous regime. So capitalism is built on the moral, ethical, and social foundations given to it by feudalism and destroys that foundation. That's Schumpeter, and here we are. It's pretty obvious that that was a good call by Marx and a good call by Schumpeter.
Yeah.
All that is solid melts into air.
Well, I want to bring the conversation back just a little bit because in your list of terms, you said you liked gaslighting.
Yeah.
But you didn't like one of the terms on the list was microaggression.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Why do you not like microaggression? Or first of all,
yeah. So I think this is a fun thing to think about. I may have written that before I read a little more about where microaggression comes from.
Okay.
But I'm not backing away from it. I loathe that expression. But it comes from a guy whose name I'm going to forget, but a radical, and I certainly don't use that in a disparaging way, but a radical black Harvard professor, I think. And I think he was observing, he was looking at the sort of experience that Paul Robeson had when he was a footballer. And it wasn't Paul Robeson's experience, but it was some other black person or people. And they're in the football team and they're constantly belittled. And so he coins this expression microaggression because his experience of racism in the world that he's in, and this is 1970, 71, something like that. His experience of this is that it is a form of aggression. It's a very powerful form of oppression. It's a very powerful form of, it just makes you feel small and hopeless and incompetent and all the rest of it. So I'm all good with it, with him cooking up that expression. He says that's a microaggression, or this is microaggression, and I'm going to talk about it in that way. So that is an extremely legitimate way to draw attention to this process as experienced. Fast forward a few decades, and it's taken over as a term that is now in very wide currency. And what happens is, so the way I encountered the term is that I encountered this term as what I would call today, what my mother would call being patronizing. Making comments that are kind of insensitive, stupid, or maybe not that insensitive or stupid, but are capable of reasonably being taken in that vein. And it certainly is appropriate. It behoves us to seek to be sensitive about those things. And just to speak about something more important in a way, again, actually curious about other people rather than thinking that they should be learning from you. So this word microaggression is now used, by HR people and all this sort of stuff. And it is a microaggression to ask where someone comes from. And why might you ask where they come from? Well, they might look exactly like you. They might look different to you. We are now wiping out questions like, where do you come from? I can certainly understand that someone who might have, to quote Deng Xiaoping, Chinese characteristics, someone who's got a Mongolian fold in their eyes, if they're wandering around Australia and everyone says, where do you come from? And they grew up in Melbourne, they were born in Melbourne, they've got an Australian accent, and they grew up in Melbourne, that's going to piss them off. And it's entirely legitimate to say we've had enough of questions like that. It's also, there's something to be said on the other side of this, which is that if you are to show curiosity, about people, and it is a generous curiosity, then you have to start somewhere. And I once said to a woman I had just bumped into in Vienna, what did she do? And again, I know that I rather dislike that conversation because that question sort of places you. I don't like judging people by what they do, but on the other hand, it's a very quick introduction to a whole bunch of associations and set of possible pathways for the conversation. And I said that, and she was, I don't know whether she was offended. She was kind of quite rude to me, which is okay. So we're losing an ease, and I think it's better to, if I want to start a conversation with somebody with Chinese characteristics, I'm calling it, ironically, I think it's better if I don't say, where do you come from? I try and just talk to them as if they're just, as if I haven't noticed this in a way, which is, again, its own kind of falsification. And it comes with its own costs. That's all right, but it comes with its costs, and I'm not sure that those costs, well, there will be plenty of situations where those costs are actually greater than the benefits, and some where they're not. Yeah. Very hard. It's very difficult terrain.
Yeah, my approach to that usually is to say, but instead of asking where are you from, I would say, let's say we're in New York City. I might say, are you from New York originally, or something like this? But it's something we had to.
And they could take offence.
Yeah.
If they're black or whatever, or Asian, say, they can take offense at that, and they can call that a microaggression. And I can tell you one thing, it's not an aggression from your point of view.
Yeah.
It's certainly, it can be experienced as that, and it can certainly, I think it's unlikely, most reasonable people won't, if they are truthful, think of it as an aggression, but it's a bit presumptuous, it's a bit careless, a bit lacking in imagination, and it can be a pain in the ass. I fully accept that. It's not an aggression.
Yeah.
It's almost invariably not an aggression to say to someone, where do you come from?
Yeah. Yeah, but it's I think it's, that this term microaggression was being used actually pretty. I started hearing it a lot in the foreigner community in Japan. A little bit before I started hearing it, kind of the broader English-speaking world, and at the time I felt it was a little bit. How should I put this? I felt that it was being a little bit too. There was an aspect of it that felt like it was willfully misinterpreting the circumstances or the context in which you were being asked a question. So a good example of this is, and I don't hear this as much as I used to, but it used to be the case, especially here in Japan, where you would go to a meal with a Japanese person you'd met recently, and they would bring out the chopsticks and they would say, "Oh, can you use chopsticks?" And most people say, "Yeah, I can use chopsticks. It's no problem."
Yeah.
And I think that it's easy to take offense in a way at something like that. Another example is people would say, if you said some really simple Japanese, like hello in Japanese, they would say, "Oh, you're very good at Japanese, aren't you?"
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think it comes from a desire to be hospitable to people who are obviously not not members.
Especially in Japan. That's a very acculturated sense of hospitality.
Yeah. And I think that this is something that is unfortunately, when you're having a conversation with people these days, there are a lot of questions that I think people would have asked 50 years ago or 60 years ago now, where you're like, how's your family? Where are you from? What do you do? These sorts of questions, which I think were asked out of a general desire to somehow extend the idea, this sense of community around someone they just met or someone they didn't know very well.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's a sense in which, I think that it's interesting how you talk about microaggression as being a kind of, it's like a new term for patronizing. And I think it certainly does have a sense of that. But at the same time, there's something much more there's something much more, let's say, aggressive.
It's weaponized. It's weaponized, and it's highly ironic that it accuses the other of aggression. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Just like Donald Trump complaining about fake news. It's the very conversational acme of aggression to define something that you're unhappy with that the other person is doing as an aggression. And these are propaganda tactics. These are weaponizing tactics. This is the debate. I was kind of come back to this. It's a framing tactic, and the manual was written in the 70s, or whenever people agreed that the two sides of the abortion debate were pro-life and pro-choice. Well, who's against life and who's against choice? So that's what it is. It's a nasty. I've got to exempt the originator of the term from this, but its used, its residue in the culture is a nasty, ungenerous, grabbing for the ugly, grabbing for the moral high ground. Can't stand it.
Well, I think there are certainly cases where you could make the case that
You could. That's right.
In those situations, it's not really micro. It's like if I were in Melbourne and I said to somebody, what country are you from, or what part of China are you from, or something like this, and they were from Melbourne.
Yeah,
that's insulting, and that's an aggression. It's not a microaggression, I guess.
Well, but it would only be, surely aggression is something that you intend. And so it could just be damn patronising.
Yeah, well, that's true.
And so why would you immediately go to the worst possible interpretation of what the person means when, and all the time you're posing, in most of these cases, one is posing as the bringer of peace, as the embodiment of Enlightenment values, of not judging people, etc., etc. So I just think it's a train wreck of a. I mean, I can't object to the term, but I can certainly object to its ubiquity, its bureaucratization, and so on. Although, I mean, another good question would be, well, in the situation that the scholar who used the term, what do you want to use? And I mean, if you could quarantine it for that, I suppose that's fine. And patronising is probably too mild. Enclosing somebody else in dominant presumptions is bad news, super bad news, but it's not necessarily aggressive.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I think it's interesting. There's a whole kind of class of these new terms, some of which you've listed, which in a way they had an older counterpart. There were older words for these. I think, for example, in some of the narrative around these, whether or not a book is like a good example of this was there was a debate recently around the book To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a book that every seventh grader in America used to read anyway, and I think they still tend to read it. And there was a teacher who appeared in one of these parent-teacher meetings that got kind of rebroadcast to Fox News, and they were all, attacking this poor woman who, was making this case about why this book wasn't very good. And she was using a lot of the language of this critical race theory. But at the end of the day, I think you could also just say that book was fairly, and it's always been kind of sanctimonious in tone. And her term was talking about how it's this white savior story and this and that, and all these other criticism, how it traumatized the people who are reading it, who are, minorities and so forth. But, it was always kind of like that. And I think you could read that book even back then and say, well, this is pretty sanctimonious. I mean, why is this story? The story is about a black man who's been accused of rape. And so why is the story about the lawyer who
the white lawyer.
And so, I think that there's always been a sense in which you could look at these things with, let's say, an older vocabulary. But it's interesting how you use this term bureaucratized, and I think that's an area where these words fit a little bit better into a kind of vocabulary that can be used to pin down certain behaviors and attack them in a manner that may or may not be productive, depending on how they're being used.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You mentioned critical race theory. I haven't said a word about critical race theory, and I mean, I don't know that much about it, but I've always thought that I've never bought into all the excitement about postmodernism. In fact, I was kind of intimating that earlier on. And likewise with CRT, the Frankfurt School are very powerful social analysts, are trying to take Marx's insights into culture, and I think they come up with some real riches. I think the problem is to imagine that it in fact gets back to the very thing I was talking about, which is this distinction between forensically identifying a thing that you think is wrong and then deducing from that what you ought to do about it. And I think quite a lot of CRT, insofar as I've encountered it, as I was saying, I think that bloke, and again, it's terrible I can't just come up with his name. I should have had it. I'll have it on a new version of that list that I sent you. But that guy was a critical race theorist, I'm pretty sure. And there's lots to be said for this as a way to explain the structures of power, the discursive structures of power, to explain how those discursive structures of power are experienced by those at the blunt end of them, maybe I should say the pointy end of them, at the bottom, at the people on whom various kinds of oppression, cultural oppression, if you like, are inflicted. And then there's the question of what you do about it, and thinking that you can bureaucratize and outlaw certain things by having a bunch of bureaucrats and people who write codes of behaviour write this stuff out and then police it. If you imagine that is going to solve your problem, it's going to go somewhere else. It's again, I'm not saying one must never do those things, but there's this idea that once we've done this fancy theoretical analysis, that certain practical consequences follow. Not so. They might and they might not. That's another part of the argument, and that just gets left out. And that's one of the things that I think is happening now.
Yeah. Well, sounds like a lot to dig in there too, as always. But maybe we should stop there for today. I hope that this article on these terms will be up on your blog soon. So anyone who's watching this should have a look. Maybe there'll be a link in the description and you can click and.
Well, I will. I'll at the very least top and tail what I've got, but I might put a bit more work into it, pop it up, and then I can embed our little chat.
Well, sounds really good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Nicholas. Great talking to you as always.
Thanks, Pete.
Bye.
Bye.